Item I-5, presentation of Federal Emergency Management Agency, August 22nd, 2019, flood hazard data and draft flood insurance rate maps, availability and future timeline for preliminary firms, appeals, and final firms.
Good morning, Commissioners. As you know, the county did receive the draft FEMA floodplain maps from FEMA the day after your last board meeting. And staff has started going through those changes with the consultant, Woods Hole, to determine where we see.
Can we get that on our television screens? Oh, there we go.
You just did.
Yay!
Now can you read them?
So we are in the process right now of going through the maps and developing our lists of issues that we identify on the mapping. The county's previous study for surge was done 30 to 40 years ago. So the maps are very different than what we've seen in the past. When you look at them, you will also see new categories. And so we've done our best to put all of this information out on the website. We've issued public announcements. And we are hoping that the public will look at their areas and provide comments to a special email address that we've set up so we can track any public input that we would include in our analysis. The process that we've now started is a very long process. We're at the beginning. We will have about 2 to 3 months to evaluate the draft maps. We are anticipating providing the staff comments by the week of September 23rd. They have asked for our comments back 30 days after the draft maps were released.
Christine, will those comments be informed by whatever our consultants have provided? In other words, is Woods Hole, will they have seen them at this point as well?
Yes, we are coordinating with them often. They're looking at our staff comments and they're developing their own comments. Okay. So yeah, we all have kind of a different role in what we're doing right now. The good news is for us, the draft maps are draft. And so we're not in an official time clock yet.
Uh-oh.
$5.
$5 fine.
$5 fine.
And the Burton Memorial Food Pantry thanks you.
Oh, is that George?
Is that you?
Good going, George. Good going.
You didn't turn it off fast enough.
So right now, what will start an official time clock is preliminary flood maps being issued. When FEMA was down, they indicated they plan to issue the preliminary maps on December 9th. We have officially requested that be delayed until after the holiday, just so the public have the maximum amount of time to look at the preliminary maps, because once the preliminary maps are issued, they start the community outreach meetings, which then they are planning to do in January. You'll recall that we did retain an outreach specialist in this area, and we will do far more outreach than what FEMA is willing to do for us. So there will be a lot of chamber meetings, real estate meetings, different groups that help inform the public on these types of issues. After the notices are published that these maps are available, then we have a 90-day time period to appeal anything on the maps or the modeling that we do not agree with. So that's shown up in the timeline. Appeals can take anywhere from 4 to 18 months, even longer in certain cases. So we're not really expecting the new maps to be adopted until 2021-ish. FEMA thinks differently, And of course, they want to expedite as much as possible, but based on what we're seeing, that's what we anticipate. I'm going to turn it over to Carl Bursa, who is our Chief Floodplain Administrator for the county. One of them, we have two, one's in the Lower Keys. And he's just going to walk you through some basics about our existing maps and some new items that you're going to see on the new maps. And this is for the benefit of the public primarily because it's different from what they're looking at. So Carl, come on up.
Good morning, Madam Mayor. Good morning, Commissioners, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Carl Bursa. I'm the Chief Floodplain Regulatory Officer Upper Keys and Ocean Reef, and I'm going to be going over some of the information about our current flood situation and what is going to be happening with the draft maps. So you'll see on your screen, as of right now, Monroe County has 4 flood zones that are currently on our maps. We have Zone AE, which again is what we refer to as the 1% annual chance. It is the widest zone in the county. We have the most numbers of structures impacted by Zone AE. Zone VE are mostly coastal properties and areas that are next to some form of water. The area which is inundated by that 1% annual chance with the wave action, which is up to 3 feet, which is 3 feet or greater, excuse me. The shaded X zone, which is the first of what we refer to as the good zones, where you have a 0.2% annual chance, or in layman's terms, what we refer to as the 500-year floodplain. And then the unshaded X, which is your actual 0.01 or 1 in 1,000 chance of flooding. The two X zones are the highest zones. Zone V obviously is going to be the one that you're going to have the most difficulty with in a base flood elevation. This is a map comparison side by side of 2 areas with the old map and the new map. So the first thing that you're going to notice, and again, this is Buttonwood Shores and Point Pleasant and Key Largo. The first thing you're going to notice about the new map versus the old map is the new map is much more detailed. You're going to see a lot more movement of the lines. They're not as straight as they once were. They actually do follow the topography and the LiDAR data for these areas very, very closely. With this particular panel, one thing you'll notice is that the shaded X zone, which is colored red, is much larger. On the old map, you'll notice an area that looks sort of gray. That's your old unshaded X, and you can see that in this particular map, the shaded X got larger while the unshaded X got smaller. What that means is that your 0.01% annual chance got smaller while your 0.2% chance got larger. You'll also notice a feature that I'm going to be discussing a little more at length. On the new maps, you'll see a bunch of little triangles that follow a very small black line. That is our limits of moderate wave action line, and I'm going to speak to that a little bit more down the road. This is Duck Key, again showing you the old map and the new map. This one is really good because you can really see where the limits of moderate wave action line is. It's a very, very nice, tight, sort of circle-ish area right there in the center of the line. You can see here that the VE zone is much more clear on these maps, but you'll also notice that the VE elevations are actually lower here. A lot of VE10 versus with the old one where you've got VE14s. And again, just to reiterate, the number behind the letter characterizations, that is your base flood elevation. That is how high, based on the particular map, the water will be in that particular area when there is a base flood event.
Carl, the little triangles.
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to make sure I've understood this correctly. Where they point out, that is where the new coast.
I was going to get to that.
Okay.
But yes, you're 100% right.
Okay.
When the direction that they are pointing to is going to be an entirely new zone, that new delineation is going to be something that's very important. I'm going to speak to that in just a moment.
Okay.
But yeah, just to be clear, where the arrows point is going to be a different flood zone than the area behind it. Different regulations, different rules. This is Cudjoe Gardens, and again, you're going to see very clearly here where the maps have done there's been a lot of change. You'll notice to the north, there is a significant area where the V zone has encroached. Down along the edge of the coast there, you'll see it's gone in a little bit further, and then again, the Limois line very, very clearly depicted there. And just so we're clear, you're seeing a couple of little lines with numbers on them that says 201 and 203. Those are transects where FEMA has done exact specific studies of those areas. Those transects are one of the things that informs the models and helps people to understand, helps FEMA to understand what the topography of the area is, and then the different wave action based on the bathymetry at the ends. So this is going to be the end result of the new maps with flood zone determinations. Again, you're going to see your VE flood zone where your wave height is 3 feet or greater. At the end of the VE zone used to be an AE zone. Now, with the new flood maps, you're going to see a completely new area, which is going to be delineated as a coastal A zone. This is where your wave heights go from 3 feet down to 1.5 feet. Following Hurricane Katrina, FEMA did multiple studies and noted that wave action between 3 feet and 1.5 feet is almost as destructive as wave action 3 feet or greater. And because of that, they have this new line. That line is the limits of moderate wave action, or LMWA, which you saw. And then behind the LMWA, you have the 1.5 foot or less wave action, and that is where your traditional A zone takes over. And at the limits of the A zone, where your 0.2% annual chance of flooding, that's where your X zones begin.
They have not determined how they're going to use the coastal A zone in terms of rating yet, though, have they?
No, ma'am.
They have
As
not
of right
promulgated.
now, to our understanding, the coastal A is going to be treated exactly the same as the A zone. And again, with Risk Map 2.0 coming out, we don't know
what the heck they're
exactly.
doing.
And again, just to show you, this is where your affected areas are there with the coastal A and the LMWA. So identifying your limits of moderate wave action on your new maps. This is a good tight shot. For those of us who are old enough to remember the old school weather people, we remember the old frontal boundaries that you would see sometimes where you're one front, cold front. It looks a lot like that. But yeah, this small, very thin line with the triangles is what you're going to be looking at. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this particular site right here, this particular panel, you're going to see that it's sort of highlighted in white. This is a situation where the coastal A, where the limits of moderate wave action line actually traces the flood zone line, the actual delineation between one base flood elevation and another. More often than not, what you're going to see is this. But every now and then, you'll see it branch off, and it does its own little thing, and it's a very, very thin black line in between two white lines. That means that you're going to have it split zoned between the base flood elevation where it will be coastal and the base flood elevation where it will not be coastal. So again, with this, they're characterized by that thin black line. It's always located landward of the V zone boundary. So when you find the VE zone, when you see the yellow on the new maps, look for the LMWA. It's not going to be very far away, generally speaking. And again, as Commissioner Coldiron pointed out, the arrows point to the new coastal A zone. So if you're going to take a look at this next slide here, I tried to make it as simple as I could, and I found a place where the LMWA actually bisects, and you'll see right here, the lines on the lines on either side, the arrows are going to point to the area that will be the coastal A zone, and the area where the arrows point away from it in the center there is not a coastal A. That is a regular AE zone. And this is a really good example because you're going to see where it says Zone AE8. Everything behind the white line to the north is going to be an AE8 zone. The difference is going to be everybody behind the black line, the LMWA line, is going to have coastal A designation versus on the other side of it, where the arrows are pointing away from it, it's going to be a regular A zone. Now, why is this important?
Well, wait, go back to that for a second.
You got it. Maybe. Hope I didn't blow it. There we go.
Explain what the little brown or beige
The little brown, the little beige
section.
section in the center there
Yeah.
is a 0.2x flood zone.
So that's
that is a shaded X flood zone right in the middle of all that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you
Got
for
it.
pointing that out. All right. Next up. This is important with the coastal A zones because per Florida building code, your building requirements are different. You have higher standards for coastal A flood zones. Florida building code requires that V zone construction requirements are required for where the coastal A zone is delineated, in addition to ASCE 2414 where this is put in. The IRC requires a foot of freeboard for coastal A. Of course, we already have that in the Florida Building Code native, so that doesn't really impact us. And again, Just as a disclaimer, these are draft maps, they're not final, changes will likely be made. But with the newly mapped coastal A-zone properties, before, your design flood elevation measurement would be where your lowest finished floor elevation was. With your space below your design flood elevation, if you had an enclosure down there, you would just have to vent it. You would have to make sure that you had your flood-proof materials, but there are slightly different requirements. You can put your utility lines. You can attach them to the underside of the walls there. You can, there are other things. Your walls would not have to be breakaway. They could be solid poured concrete. You didn't have to have a visa and construction certificate, which in the county we require engineer certification that the construction that is below the design flood elevation in VE flood zones is designed to perform to those standards, either through breaking away or that it's going to stay in place. And if the maps are adopted as they are currently shown, and again, the maps are not final, but if we get the coastal A zones in, then the design flood elevation measurement is going to be to the bottom of the beam or the lowest horizontal structural member. So that can be anywhere from 18 inches, 12 to 18 inches, depending on how thick your beam is of the downstairs. Your space below the design flood elevation also has to be vented and has to be breakaway construction. You cannot have any utility lines attached to any of those walls. You have to make sure that everything in there, pretty much everything in your enclosure downstairs, you need to be ready to lose. V-zone construction and coastal A construction cert is going to be required for all new construction in this area.
In the coastal
In the
A.
coastal A, correct. And again, now we're moving on to something else that is going to be different between the old maps and the new maps. We have a datum change. Monroe County currently uses the National Geodetic Vertical Datum of 1929, or NGVD 29. We will be shifting with the new maps over to the North American Vertical Datum of 1988, or NAVD 88. The new mapping elevations, we're going to begin the process of data conversion at a time to be determined, again, probably closer to when the new maps will be made final. Once the datum conversion takes effect, Monroe County will require all of our information in NAVD. We'll not be able to accept anything in NGVD anymore.
You want to explain what that?
I was just,
that
yeah. One step ahead of you.
It sounded like a VCR versus a DVD
It
player.
is, and that's actually it's not a really bad comparison. But with the difference here, again, the current datum in use with NGVD 29, they use benchmark-based data, and the county currently requires that on all of our permits. With the NAVD, the new firm panels are all in NAVD. The trick is that NAVD and NGVD both try to find 0 for your elevation. The difference is with NAVD, your 0 is lower than your NGVD. So no matter what happens, your elevation, your ground floor elevation, when you all get your new elevation certificates, they're going to be at least 1.3 feet lower depending on where you are in the county. Key West and the Lower Keys, the datum conversion is approximately 1.3-ish. And then once you get to the Marathon area, the Middle Keys, it gets to be around 1.37 to 1.45. And then up in the Upper Keys, it's about 1.5 feet, 1.55 feet. You're going to subtract that from whatever your existing elevation is. And again, we have a nifty link that I'm going to get to at the very end where you can actually go and see your individual property's conversion.
And the 29 and 88 refer to the years when the benchmarks were set, 1929 versus 88.
This is as good of a visual representation as I think we can show you here to show you the difference between the two datums. So you're going to see again, where the water line is, it's going to be, the difference between NAVD and NGVD is going to be smaller for NAVD. It's always going to be a lower measurement. And again, you can see the difference. They're both 2 feet. The only difference is that the actual reading of the elevation is different for the NAVD because it has a lower 0. Some folks are taking it. Okay, everybody get a good look at that? All right. And again. So our initial observations for the new flood maps. BFEs, generally speaking, throughout the Keys are lower. Now, before you say hip, hip, hooray, also remember that your elevations are also lower because of the datum conversion. So in some situations, you'll look and you'll see your flood zone or your base flood elevation hasn't changed at all. You'll go from an AE8 to an AE8. Be careful though, because don't forget, you have to subtract your datum conversion from that number. So the old NAV or NGVD 88, I was getting confused myself. The old NGVD 29 measurement is going to be 1.3 to 1.5 feet higher than your NAVD measurement. So your flood zone, your actual base flood elevation will possibly have gone down. So the VE zones in the upper keys have been drastically reduced. Specifically, Bayside communities are going to see their V zone almost disappear in some places. Buccaneer Point is a perfect example. Buccaneer Point had VE 12 and VE 14. Now the limits of moderate wave action line actually dies where the shoreline begins. The datum change, again, I went over that, means even when your BFEs are lower, your property may still be below the new base flood elevation. So I highly recommend that once it gets closer to adoption, you get an elevation certificate and request that the data be presented to you in NAVD 88 format. The Limwa lines are present in most areas. Very, very seldom you'll see a few places where there's a break in it, but pretty much anywhere there's a shoreline, if you go in a few feet, you'll see that it is there. The oceanside Limwa is a lot larger. Specifically, again, I'm Upper Keys, and so I do a lot of work in the Upper Keys. A lot of what I noticed was Upper Keys areas. The largest Limwa line that we have is 1,750 feet inland from the coast, which means that there are people who won't even be able to see the water who will have to build to V-zone standards if the maps go into effect as currently. So versus other areas, which again, there are some areas where you'll see the Limwa line is basically, like with Buccaneer Point, almost non-existent, or when it is there, it's 40 to 80 feet wide, roughly. The highest positive change that we noticed, there were a few lucky folks who went from VE 17 to unshaded X, basically more than a 17-foot to the better change. Other folks, the highest negative change that we saw was this AE8 to VE11 or AE8 to coastal AE11. Yeah, the CAZ, just so you don't get my acronyms right, is coastal A zone, or CAZ. So what that means is these folks are basically going to see about a 3.5 to 4 foot to the negative change, depending on their construction. And again, in summary, to remind you, draft maps are not final maps. They can and probably will change. The final maps can be processed through adoption in 2020, pending the outcome of any, 2021, pending the outcome of any appeals. And our Land Development Code, Chapter 122, we have rewrites in the process, and these are going to have to go through the usual process, Community Impact Meeting, DRC, Planning Commission, and to you folks, and then up to DEO once that's done. The applicants are able to review the draft maps online, and then again, I'm going to go to the next slide, actually has our links on it. You can do that, or you can come in and speak with either myself in the Upper Keys office or Mary Wingate in the Marathon office. We'll be happy to take time and sit down with you and go over the changes. We really do recommend that you first look at them online and then come in and talk to us about what they mean. Or if you have multiple properties, you of course can send emails. The email again is on our draft map page. And again, to reiterate, they are not regulatory. You do not have to construct to them right now. It's simply us giving you folks a heads up on where the changes could be headed. They do show the Limwa lines in the newly mapped coastal A's, and we can get down, I want to say that we can zoom in to just about 800 to 1,200 feet up, so we can get a really good look. The trick is that they start to, the image gets a little fuzzy when you zoom in a lot, and FEMA hasn't made this to the parcel level yet, so there are a few places where you're going to see the line. It might touch your property, it might not. We won't know that until we are actually able to get down into the details and figure out if you are a part of it. And again, here are our helpful links: Monroe County Floodplain Management website, our current flood maps, our draft map website, and the SwiftMud datum conversion that I told you about. Especially the bottom one, that's going to be really helpful to everybody who is looking at the possibility of potentially becoming non-conforming. This is going to show you exactly what the conversion is going to be for your specific property. So I'm going to leave this up so you can take pictures of it or do whatever you need to, and I will ask if you folks have any questions of me.
I have two.
Yes, sir.
One is, since I can't read that. It's half a page of writing. Would you send us those, please?
Absolutely.
Those links. And two, just to be sure about this, these are county-wide regulations when they are adopted. They apply in cities as well as the county?
Yes, sir. This is Florida Building Code. The Florida, once these go final, it's Florida Building Code for Coastal A. But again, we wouldn't enforce rules in Marathon or.
No, I'm not asking who enforces it. I'm asking if we're going to have consistency throughout the county.
Not necessarily.
So I would answer a little bit differently than Carl, just because of the steps that we each have to take. Each local government will review their draft maps that cover their geographic area. They may have different opinions of the maps than we do.
Sure.
Each local government is required to adopt the final maps. If you do not adopt the final maps after all the appeals are settled, then you automatically become ineligible for the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program. But the Florida Building Code, and this is what Carl was referring to, it is consistent in the cities and the counties because we're all under a state mandated Florida Building Code. Each government, when they adopt the maps by ordinance, ours will be Chapter 122 as an amendment, we may, and we already do, have different requirements than the cities. We have things that we do that are considered over and above the minimum requirements, and that's how we get points in the community rating system. And each government has their own set of extra things they do or different requirements that they have.
So the answer is yes and no.
Depends on what the item is.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I just have a comment. Don't everybody panic. Because for one thing, your individual flood insurance is based on your property's elevation above this base elevation. So what they're talking about now is what the topography and the elevation of the land is. Your house may be elevated above. Having said that, get an elevation certificate as soon as you can. If you don't have flood insurance, even if you're not required to carry it now, get it, because whoever may purchase your house from you down the road may need a mortgage, which would mean they are required to have flood insurance. And if you start now, no matter what they do with the rates, you're starting at a lower rate, and you won't be hitting whatever their eventual actuarially sound rate is, which we don't know.
And I also have a comment. I'm so very grateful I do not sit at your desk.
And so again, we have a few months to be looking at these maps and for everyone to go on the website, click down, find your individual property. And if you have any questions, our staff is here and they're ready to work with you individually.
I want to talk to you when we go on break.
To reiterate what Commissioner Crowther said, she's absolutely right. The flood insurance, if you don't have it, if you're eligible for it, please go out and get it. We cannot stress that enough. Even if you're in an X zone, even if you think you're going to stay in an X zone, get it, keep it up to, keep your policy up to date. That's going to help you a lot down the road. And then,
What if you don't have flood insurance, but you have an elevation certificate?
you still need to get it.
Get what?
Even get a flood, you still would get a flood policy. Even if you have an elevation certificate, don't forget with that datum conversion, that minus 1.5 or whatever feet, it could put you below the new base flood elevation.
Can you say again how when you want us to have people get an elevation certificate
Sure.
and have it be converted into a?
And yeah, have them when the time comes, when you're ready to get when we start getting closer to the new flood maps, your new elevation certificate, you're going to be asking for the data to be relative to NAVD 88.
NAVD 88.
Correct.
Thank you.
At what point will the engineers know that they have to, and the surveyors know that they have to comply with NAV 88?
We'll tell them in our ordinance.
Okay.
The reason that Carl and Commissioner Crothers are advising you to get flood insurance now, even if you're in an X zone, or if you're self-insured because you, financially you're able to cover the potential flood, is that if you have a current policy and something changes, under today's regulations, you're grandfathered in with your existing policy. And there's been lots of changes in how much they can increase your flood insurance rate. So if you have the policy and you're grandfathered and now in a year you sell that house and it can transfer to the new owner, they won't automatically have to buy flood insurance that's 75% higher than the rate you have, because they will get to take over your policy.
Yeah, flood insurance is the only insurance that is assumable.
And if you don't have it, and then that buyer finds out what they might have to pay in flood insurance because you didn't have it,
Might not buy your
it could
house.
kill your sale. So it's very important, and that's the message that FERM, I think, has really been pushing in the past 6 or 8 months. We're not insurance advisors, though, Monroe County, but the person that we hired to do the outreach with us is an insurance expert. So hopefully, when we do the community outreach meetings, he will be there to help people. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl.
Thank you, ma'am.